In last week's episode, we explored the importance of commitment in relationships, but the power of commitment is something that affects so many aspects of our day-to-day experience. So today we're going to look at the bigger picture and what role your commitments are playing in shaping your life. So I'm going to share why it's a myth that you're not able to commit, why commitment has the power to shape your life, why there's confusion around commitments, and I'll give you my thoughts on how you can choose commitments that truly support you. Plus, we'll look at why it's important to do a commitment audit, and I'm going to tell you how you can do that. So, what are you committed to? It's a really important question, so let's dive in. Welcome to the Be a Brilliant Human podcast with me, Joel Young. If you're looking to improve your life, to heal, to grow, and mature as an individual, but maybe you found that some of the personal development and consciousness stuff has given you the impression that you need to be super serious and vigilant to get anywhere meaningful, or feeling like maybe you're just not up to snuff, well, this show is here to remind you of your humanity, and in fact that's where your true joy and brilliance lies. With over 25 years of experience in the transformation biz and having developed MPA, one of the world's simplest, pressure-free approaches to growth and well-being, if I do say so myself, I'll be sharing tips, steps, and insights that'll help you navigate all the aspects of life as a growth-seeking being. On this show, it comes to you with a good dose of humour, maybe a smattering of colourful language, a reminder not to take things so personally, and most importantly, to be kind to yourself along the way. Make sure you hit that follow button, and let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to the Be a Brilliant Human podcast with me, Joel Young. I'm delighted that you're here. We are at episode 102, which means two things. Firstly, if you want to see the show notes for today, you just go to www.beabrillianthuman.com/102. And that also means there's 101 previous episodes for you to binge listen to if you're brand new. And if you've listened to them before, you can always revisit them. Always get a bit more on a second run through, and even more on a third. You never know. And if you are new, I'm so delighted that you've found this show. I hope that you enjoyed today's, and if you do, make sure you go hit that follow button or subscribe button, whichever flavour it is. I do believe Apple's now changed it to follow, which I think is what it is on Spotify. But you know what I mean. Hit the button that says you're going to hear every time that I put a new podcast out. You'll know what it is. And it does wonderful things for the algorithm and all that wonderful stuff. So I'd appreciate it. And if you resonate with this show, hit that button, whatever flavour it is. So as I said in the intro, this week I'm kind of doing a follow-up to last week's ranty episode on commitment in relationships. Now I say ranty, but I've actually had several people now get in touch with me, emails and directly, and say, Joel, that wasn't much of a rant. Fail. I think what they were trying to say is I did it with a smile. But I think it definitely touched some buttons in some people, and in a good way, made people think about certain things, which is what I always hope with this show, that it sort of stirs the pot a bit, gives you some perspectives to chew on, and hopefully guides you in some way to things that resonate with you that make your life flow in a smoother way. So, by the way, on that note, from last week's episode, I talked a bit in that episode about, the key of it was, the main myth with commitment and relationships was that, commitment's not bondage, it doesn't trap you, it really is about presence, it's about fully being there. And the other side of that, which I really didn't go into last time, is that if you're on the receiving end of somebody who isn't, if someone's not committed in that way, and that can be challenging in various ways. And some of us can get stuck in those relationships, even though we know better. So I'll point you to a couple of support products that I've got there. So firstly, one of the reasons we stay in those kind of toxic relationships is because we're susceptible to manipulation. Some of the really not so nice people in this world have a tendency to have very bad relational behavior and somehow make you think like it's all your fault, or it's not really happening, even though things are kicking off in you, that something's off. So if that's something you recognize, then I recommend you check out Bulletproof. Bulletproof is a program which will show you all 7 manipulation tactics and how to handle them so that you don't get stuck feeling like you're crazy and being manipulated. You just need to go, and I'll put both, by the way, both of these I'm going to recommend to you. I'll put links in the show notes for you, but the link for that is, again, www.thenpaacademy.com/bulletproof if you want to check that out. And Bulletproof, actually, the content of Bulletproof is part of a much bigger program called Boundary Bootcamp, because understanding the manipulations is part of having really healthy boundaries. And another thing that I see with people get stuck in relationships where the person they're with doesn't have that commitment and they're very difficult is because we have poor boundaries. So if you recognize that, and by the way, I could really go off on one of them, the importance of boundaries in your life, having healthy boundaries, but nobody really tells us, and especially good-hearted people, we tend to be taught that somehow it's nicer to have no boundaries, or in some schools of thought, it's more spiritual to have no boundaries. Well, it's not being a brilliant human, my friend. So Boundary Bootcamp is like a 4-week roll your sleeves up program. And so if you want to go and check it out, find out all about it, you can again go to www.thenpaacademy.com/boundary-bootcamp. Have a look at that. And also check out those links. They'll be in the show notes. All right. So in relationships, it's about commitment being his presence, as in being there in your relationship. But I wanted today to take it a little bit wider because, as I said in the intro, commitment is something that affects so many different areas of our lives. And so I think today what I want to do is look at how that threads into all different aspects of our lives. And I noticed that there were certain myths again that sort of keep us from really being conscious and mindful of what our commitments are. And of course, how the hell, if you realize you're committed to the crappy stuff, do you get committed to the good stuff? Sound good? All right, let's do this. Okay, so I want to start off with talking about, I want to confront one of the biggest myths. So I would say it's kind of a lie that we tell ourselves when it comes to commitment. And it's when we tell ourselves that, I don't commit. I'm not someone who easily commits. I'm not someone who is committed to much, or is that kind of flavor. So it's a bit of an illusion, the idea that it's somehow that you're not committed to something. Because here's the truth, my friend, the truth according to Joel, at least, which is you are committed. You are very committed to a whole bunch of things in your life. You're always committed to something. So the question is, and you might be saying, well, how can you say that? Well, I'm committed to. We just have to look around. The things that you do regularly are the things that you commit to. Now, it might not seem obvious because most of the conversation around commitment, especially when it comes to practices like being healthy and all those kind of things, it comes with a whole slew of other ideas. But the fact that you're saying it's I'm not very good at committing to a specific health regime, for example, and if you then generalize that to I'm not good at committing, that's doing yourself a misservice. It's like if you can acknowledge that actually you are superb at committing because you already commit to a bunch of things, then the possibilities change enormously, and in my opinion, you're much more aligned with yourself. Because it changes the conversation, because then you start asking a really helpful question, which is, what am I actually committed to? What is it? I mean, and let's go full circle here. If you're I'm somebody who doesn't commit, I never commit, I don't like commitment, then you're probably really committed to inconsistency, or maybe it's adventure or excitement, one of those things. It'll be a different flavor for you, but you're still committed to something. It's like you can't escape the fact that you're committed at some level in some way. And often that's the case. That's what's happening is we find, and we'll talk a bit later about doing a commitment audit, that we find that what we're actually committed to begets us sabotaging behaviors on what we want. because that's where usually the conversation around commitment comes. Is like you say you want something and you don't get it, and you don't understand why you don't get what you want. um, and in that case, I'd say you're probably committing to something that doesn't do that. And basically, if it's not getting you what you want, the thing you're committing to, you're committed to something that's off for you, that's out of alignment in some way. Or maybe there's a big secondary gain to that committing to something that's off for you. But ultimately, any secondary gain, what I mean by a secondary gain is it gives you something that's perceived as a benefit, but really is a poor shadow of what you really want. Again, we kid ourselves. So many layers of kidding ourselves. But in a way, it's just a deeper commitment, and a secondary gain is just a way of hiding it from ourselves. Well, it gives me safety. Yeah, but safety, is that really what you want? Or is the gambit of safety, the secondary gain, that keeps your life small and safe and means you don't have to be vulnerable, perhaps? Which would then ultimately grow and you could become the person that you say you want to become. So it's this kind of area where you have to be really honest with yourself. But basically, you're committed to something. I mean, I literally just today I opened Facebook. Yes, it's back up. And by the way, listen to the future. This is this is a day or so after the big 2021 Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp shutdown. We were all shocked. Our lives were massively impacted. Well, I'm sure some people's were, but it was a day off social media for the rest of us. Anyway, I digress. Where the hell was I? Completely thrown myself. So that's right. I read something on Facebook today. It was up. That was where my weird train of thought went. So the post I read, and to give credit where it's due, was by Amanda Malcolm Brown. Never heard of her before, but it was shared on one of my friends' timelines. But the point why I wanted to share it is because she's laying out a point around commitment. So in her post, and I'll link to it in the show notes if you want to see it written out, because I'm going to paraphrase it, probably badly. But she talks about how in the past she's worked in different kind of bars. So she's worked in bars where there's like sort of expensive cocktails at $17 a shot, and people would buy $100 bottles of wine and still tip, and everything's really, really cool. And then she worked in a sort of a health juice bar, and then it would be like for a large glass or container of juice filled with vitamins and nutrients and really good for you, was like $10. And she said the difference was that people will come in, you'd say it's $10 for that, and they go like, really? Oh my God, how can you charge that? And then begrudgingly hand over their money. And I thought that was a really interesting sort of take on it. And she goes on to say how it demonstrates how we value things differently. So, and if I phrase that, she's using the word value, but they're very interlinked, what our commitment is to and what we value. The point she was making there is people will begrudgingly or won't be willing to pay for coaching or for, gym membership or whatever it is that would support them in their health, but they don't quibble over paying fortunes for posh bottles of wine or alcohol, or even if it's just the coffee thing and they spend hundreds a month for their daily lattes, things that potentially are not as healthy as as the other stuff, as the juices. Now, of course, that's all a question of dogma and what you think's good for you and what's not. But fundamentally, the point is, it's one of those things where's the commitment there? The commitment there, I mean, you could argue it's the commitment to alcohol or booze, but I'm going to argue that in a way it's a commitment to whatever it is that they perceive the alcohol and, the paying large inflated prices, going out versus the health and the coaching is. It's like the commitment is not on the coaching, but often the conversation is, oh, I must get healthy, all the rest of it. But those kind of actions are demonstrations of where our commitments don't necessarily meet what we say they want. Or it's just a matter of, looking at our commitments are a demonstration of our priorities. And some people would argue, I'm all for free choice, but some people would say that the commitment to hedonism isn't as good for you as commitment to juices and health. Oh, that's a discussion for another day. But you get my point. It's like, where is the commitment in these cases? And the interesting thing that I find is that whatever the commitment is, where you find your commitment, when you start investigating and going, what am I actually committed to? Taking on that you are able to commit. In fact, you're excellent at committing to things. If you examine that, you'll probably find that those commitments came along pretty effortlessly. Which brings us to the commitment myth number 2, that commitment is hard. It doesn't have to be hard. It's going to be a subtle distinction, this one. It's not that commitment itself is hard. I think the confusion here is that the tricky bit sometimes is that actually shifting your commitments is a process. And the process doesn't necessarily have to be hard. If you look at some of my episodes around taking things baby step by baby step, I'm going to talk a little bit more about micro commitments coming up. But that's a thing that is perceived as hard. So committing isn't hard because we do it effortlessly all the time. We commit to a sale. We watch a nice ad. We want something. We buy it. We commit to. There's all sorts of things we commit to, and it's not a hard thing. We just kind of do it. Most of the habits in our lives, good and bad, are commitments that we've made along the way. They've just kind of happened. So what can be, a challenge perhaps, but I would say more helpful is to think of it as a process, is shifting your commitments from one thing when you identify it as being not helpful, given what you want in the moment, to something which is more supportive. And we're going to get into that process a little bit later. So moving on from there, it brings us or illustrates how commitment is so powerful in terms of shaping our lives. So I want to sort of unpack that a little bit for you. So where I'm coming from there is, what happens when you commit to something? I'm going to say that in a way, commitment by itself breeds practice. If you commit to something, that it tends to follow that. Say it's a behavior, for example, it tends to be something that you do regularly. But that really comes from the commitment starts really with a mindset. It's where your focus is. So there's this cycle of, I guess it's mindset, focus, practice, and repetition, which then builds, and it's through that mechanism of that cycle in response to what you're committing to that begins to shape your life. So you get like a response, then there's usually a behavior, there's an experience that comes from that, and then over time what that does is it tends to build an identity. And again, if you've listened to this show for a length of time, I talk a lot about non-personal awareness and MPA, which works at an identity level. And I often say that, when you shift an identity, those behaviors, beliefs, and emotions shift all by themselves. So in a sense, often we build those identities from our commitments because the practices build the identity, and then the identity takes over, and then it's in charge. So I guess what I'm saying really, or alluding to here, is that there's a strong link or crossover between identity and commitment, which kind of brings us on to sort of, what are you committing to, really? So with that in mind, I want to talk a bit about, I guess, committing to states versus outcome. Now, I talked a little bit about this in last week's episode about committing to states of being. So I have a perspective which I'm going to say right up front is not always true, but it's not a bad sort of starting point when you're thinking about what you're choosing to commit to. So generally, I think it can be really useful to consider committing to states of being. Sometimes you might think of them as feelings versus a particular outcome. Now, again, I'm going to be really clear. There's times when it's really powerful to commit to an outcome if you're doing something project-based or whatever. But I think when you commit to a state of being, there's sort of inevitably more flexibility in the outcome. There's kind of less constraint, and you're kind of open to more creative outcomes while keeping a very clear commitment. So in a way, where I'm coming at from this, and I've talked about this in previous episodes, is often we look at outcomes or external things in order to meet an internal desire, which is usually an emotion of some kind. So if I had £1 million fall into my lap, then it means I could buy stuff. That's an external thing, and have certain things. But ultimately, why do I want that? I want that because I want to feel free, or I want to feel secure, or those kind of things. So normally at the baseline, when we look at all of our desires and intentions, it usually comes back to some internal state. So in terms of commitment, I'm a big fan of committing to the underlying state that is desired from the outcome, because then you can stay committed to that, which is very powerful, and be flexible about how, to use a kind of woo-woo phrase, how the universe responds to that. But again, I'm not saying that it's never aligned, and a very powerful and a very healthy thing to commit to certain more outcome-based things, which kind of brings us, when I talk about that sort of underlying desire or emotion or the state of being, it comes back to that identity piece. So again, at the end of last episode, or towards the end of last week's episode, I talked about, who do you want to be in relationship? That's specifically because I think that state of being is a very powerful place to be in, and a place where your flexibility, your commitment, and your commitment and your identity align, allowing the flexibility that allows our humanity to breathe. And of course, then the actions will reflect that beingness and sort of anchor in, going back to what I said before, which is there's this cycle of, from the commitment comes the practice, the focus, the repetition, the experience, and that supports that identity. So you end up becoming the person that you want to be, from which many expressions in terms of outcomes can come into being, and hence you shape your life. So we're coming back now to, what are you committing to? Where is that really working for you, and where is it not? Which brings us to the commitment audit. So let's talk about that now. So what is a commitment audit? I know it sounds super sexy and inspiring. I did, but an audit, I know I know it's not sexy for most people. Okay, you're an accountant, it's sexy to you, I know. But for most people, it doesn't sound very sexy. But I kind of play on that. There's a number of my programs where I use audits. I think it's really important to get a sense of where you are. Again, something I come back to time and time again is that empowerment is most effective, self-empowerment, if you start where you are. And for the most part, people don't take the time to, with humility and a willingness to be, super honest with themselves, ruthlessly honest, you could almost say, to get a sense of where they actually are before they begin. And that's kind of, for me, what the audit process is about. So if it comes to a commitment audit, it's really about, what am I committed to right now? So things that can help you with that is you can look for the repeated patterns and experiences that show up in your life. And you really need to do an inquiry process, which is really asking yourself, so what am I actually, in terms of that repetition, in terms of those repeated experiences, what is it that I might be committed to that consistently means I end up choosing the behaviors and the actions and things that that bring that to me? So I had a client today and who'd listened to the podcast, and she was saying that for her, listening to in terms of commitment in relationship, because I was talking about commitment to relationship isn't having your eye out the door or a foot half out the door looking for the next person that's coming along. That's not commitment. It's not presence. It's none of that stuff. And she said to me, well, there's the other side of that. What if you're in a situation where, you find you're committed to somebody or somebody else's needs, or, you find you're committed to the relationship, but they're being basically a bugger. They're off with their eyes out elsewhere. which is part of why I mentioned Bulletproof and Boundary Bootcamp earlier. And that's a really good example of when you look at those repeated patterns, maybe staying in a relationship past its sell-by date, staying with toxic people, for example. So what are you actually committed to? The story is, I'm committed to the relationship. But are you? So the question is, maybe there's something else in there that you're committed to. Maybe you're committed to an idea of loyalty, which transcends health, your own well-being. So it really is, I can't give a sort of blanket answer to these things, but this is my invitation for you to inquire. If you notice there are unhealthy patterns, then watch for those stories. For example, it could be that you're committed to their needs above your needs. So you stay in these crappy relationships because somehow the commitment in you is committed to somebody else's needs in favor of putting yours down the list. Now, when you get into it, and this is a whole different topic, you can get into why that's the case, what's going on underneath the surface and all those kind of things. But just the awareness of what you're actually committing to is a really powerful thing. Because once you get the realization of what you're committed to, you can ask the really important question, which is, how's that working out for me? So commitments where, for example, you're committing to the idea of loyalty and over, putting up with crazy behavior in your direction, it's a good chance to question yourself whether that's a commitment that you'd like to keep. And that's the point of this audit. It's like, is that a commitment that works for me now? Maybe it worked in the past, or is it something that perhaps I'd like to change? Which brings you on to the next step, which is, are you ready and willing to shift your commitment? Are you willing to shift that? And that's a question that you just got to sit with. And by the way, it's one thing to say, yes, I'm ready to do it. Another thing to make then make that a rod for your back, where you suddenly have to change overnight, make a sudden shift, and just weaponize it basically. And also, it's okay to say, no, I'm not ready. I'm not ready yet to change that commitment. There may be other ones you want to focus on first. But when you do reach that state of where you're willing to shift the one that isn't working out for you, what would work better? What would be really what could benefit you more? What would be more in alignment with you now? And this is something just that's a matter of exploration of, what would feel better. And normally when you get really clear on how crappy your current commitments are, and if that's the case, the inspirations tend to come. And you don't have to sort of pick, like say, I want to pick something and stick to it for the rest of my life, although that seems like the nature of commitment. But it's a matter of just exploring, what could be different? How could I commit to something else? This is where, rather than committing, say, to a certain behavior, you could commit to certain states of being. Like, for example, in the case of my client today, what she came to really commit to was to put her well-being first. That's a friggin' wonderful commitment that still leaves loads of room for different expressions and behaviors. But it is kind of it's a commitment to putting that sense of, that inner feeling sense of well-being over and above other things that previously may have caused a lot of pain. And in it, there's loads of room for exploration. So another sort of example of that is what we do in MPA Mastery, which is the practitioner's training. So one of the things that's core to MPA and working with MPA in a really graceful way is what I call animation. Animation is a willingness to notice where the ripe fruit is in the transformation process within people. And one of the things I do early in the practitioner's program is invite a commitment to the animation, because it's so central to MPA. Because why? Because it gives you a way to work in a really agendaless, open, humble way that brings your practice into a state where you're resistance-free, you have more flexibility, it can be effortless and fun, you have this explorative mindset. It brings, if you commit to animation, this sort of exceptional sensitivity, sort of the energetic shifts and signs and signals that support your clients in finding their own natural path of transformation, healing, and growth. Now, this is a huge benefit. This is one of the great things about people who train and become practitioners in MPA. As a coach or a therapist, whatever the modality you're using, when you come to commit to animation, it shifts who you are in relation to the coaching or healing process that you do with your client, which ripples through to benefits to your client and benefits to them. And in the process of designing and really looking at what was the core thing I wanted to impart as part of MPA Mastery, I kind of identified what my experience had been in terms of previous trainings, where it's often committing to certain practices or techniques and those kind of things, versus what was the thing that made the difference, certainly in my practice over the years, and certainly has come to me through MPA. And then really examine what the benefit of that was, which helps people who come to the training to understand why that makes sense. And then, as I've laid out before, from that commitment, then the experience and reinforcement and identity shifts over time. So it's powerful to understand from what's probably, and this has been reported to me from the people that have gone through practitioners, is that often in those practitioner trainings, the commitment is kind of to the mechanics of a process. But in this commitment to animation within MPA, it opens up way more ability to be flexible and resistance free with your clients, which makes all the difference, even when it comes to using other methodologies. Now I've spouted off about that. I want to put the links. I'll put the link to MPA Mastery, which the next intake is February 2022. But if you're listening to this way after, if you just go to www.thempaacademy.com/MPA Mastery, then you can check that out. If you're listening to this and you're a coach or a therapist and will be interested in that, go take a look. Or if you're just curious and nosy, you've got no interest in being a practitioner, go and have a look. And particularly look at there's a video on that page actually, which is some feedback from the people that have been through it, and it really kind of lays this out. And they point out how there's things they can do because of their kind of commitment to animation. So the other thing I wanted to talk about here is, once you decide what it is that is going to be a more supportive and helpful commitment, then it's about really putting that into practice. If you're committing to a state, this is where that becomes a lot easier. But again, I want to use an example again, which I came across on social media today, which is a good example of micro commitments. I think micro commitments that support a larger commitment are a great way in practical terms to deal with our sort of human resistance to these kind of things. And it's actually Charlotte Kanye, who is actually on the practitioners training at the moment with MPA. And I saw her post today. She's been talking about this process. She's got a bunch of old bricks out the back, and the idea was to build a wall, dig out some earth, and it was very, very overwhelming. But she wanted to do it, so she made the commitment to 1 brick a day. She'd take 1 brick, clean it off, stick it in a pile so she could build the new wall that she wanted to create. And the simpleness of 1 brick a day made all the difference for her. And then today's post that I saw was her pile of bricks and how and her experience of the process of how it became very automatic and effortless. And often she'd do more than 1, of course, because that's the power of commitment, or the micro commitment. And her next phase was, because she had to do some digging for the foundation of the wall, was 1 spade a day. And I love that example of the power of micro commitments. And to me, those micro commitments doesn't mean you're committing less. It's chunking down the process of a bigger commitment, which is a very powerful thing to do. It's really, really helpful. All right, then. I think that wraps this up for today. And just to kind of recap on it, I think the main points I want to get across to you today is that commitment doesn't have to be hard. In fact, most of the time it isn't. We do it automatically. And I think the biggest block to really invoking the power of commitment is this idea that it's hard or that you're just not somebody who's good at committing. So the invitation today is to look at what are you actually committing to, and look at the patterns, do an audit, look at the patterns that are already going on, and do some self-inquiry about what it is in essence that you're committing to, and check, is that working for you? And if it's not, ponder and wonder what it is that you could commit to instead. And then different thoughts around that. One thing that I offer is that maybe if you focus on states rather than outcomes, that's a good way to give you the flexibility, especially if you're kind of control averse. That's a good way to go about it. And also consider micro commitment, so you can realize there's a big picture commitment that you want to make. And then if there's a way in terms of your behaviors that will support that you can chunk down, like Charlotte's 1 brick a day idea, that's a really great way to support yourself. But whatever you're committing to at the moment is a huge part of what's shaping your identity and your life at large. So I hope this has been helpful. Do let me know. I'm always open to feedback through the usual channels. I think that's it for today. Thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this show, I'd love you to do me a solid and tell someone about it. They can find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, and most other podcast platforms. Plus, if you visit the website www.BABrillianthuman.com, you can share the show notes to social media and make my day. Also, make sure you hit that follow button, and if you haven't yet downloaded the MPA process sheet, head on over to joelyoungmpa.com and get your free copy today. Big love, and see you next time.